It's always useful to have a hook to hang an idea on. This linocut hook is the first verse of the poem The Rock in the Sea by Henry Ames Blood. It is not an illustration of the poem, and it's not the first time I've used this particular hook. This short video shows the step-by-step development of the blocks, the inking and the resulting print. Over the last few years I've been collecting and reusing ideas that I liked from earlier linocuts, the textures, shapes, patterns and ideas that I thought worked. I take these ideas, redraw them, collage them together, then combine them into new compositions. This print continues that theme. The ideas for it came from several earlier linocuts. These in turn had all benefited from even earlier work. These are some of those linocuts and the principal ideas taken from them. For years I have made multi-block reduction linocuts. Traditionally these overprint each other, creating second, third and fourth colours. More recently I have used multiple blocks where I split the image into distinct areas that are also quite separate from each other. Being separate means they can overprint each other, but they can also be cut and printed individually, without impacting the other blocks. This print would use 5 distinct image blocks on 3 plates. As usual, the first thing to do was register these 5 areas with each other to make sure they all meet where they are supposed to, so they created aligned edges and importantly have no gaps. I started with the block that I knew would use the full width and height of the work. Once cut, it defined the outer edges of the linocut, the top, the bottom, left and right. I could now ink, print and transfer this block's image onto the second block. As with any transfers between blocks, for them to be successful, the second block should be slightly larger than the first. This gives room for the image to fit into. This first block is inked and printed. The print is then overlaid and printed onto the second block. In doing so, the image is transferred from block 1 to block 2. Now that I know where block 1's image is, I can accurately cut away what is needed from block 2. I now repeat that process for block 3, inking the first 2 blocks and printing them, then using that print to transfer the results to block 3. As before, I can now cut away what is not needed from the third block. Getting them all aligned is time consuming, and I spend quite a while cutting, inking and proofing to make sure they all hit the mark. When the 3 sets of blocks were complete and registered, I could then, with some certainty, start to cut and print. Each of these 3 blocks had initial elements cut from them, but it doesn't always follow that these cuts will use the white of the paper as a colour. Here are a couple of close-ups. A major difference between this and the more traditional relief print is that there is no final reveal. You know, that part when it all comes together. Doing things this way means each element reveals or completes itself at different points. To make my life easier, I simply took a photograph of the print at each stage as it hung on the drying rack. This is perhaps why its colour and shape looks a little odd, curled and at an angle. The top block was first to print. It seemed logical to start at the top and work my way down, but I could easily have started with either of the other 2 blocks. This block printed a yellow-orange. One thing I do quite consistently when printing is wiping along the block's edges. Whenever I can, that is. This removes the build-up of any ink, an excess that can spill out over the straight edge I want to achieve. The middle block was inked in quite a pale blue-grey colour, which would ultimately only be seen in the waves of the sea. I should mention here that usually when printing pale colours, they often need to be a lot darker than you think. If they are too pale, they can simply disappear when surrounded by stronger toned colours. The vast majority of this colour would disappear in subsequent steps. A yellow ochre of sorts was used at the bottom, again not too light to avoid it disappearing later. I think I should say here that throughout the printing process I continually check the way the blocks come together. I am constantly revising, cutting small slithers away to fine-tune the overlapping of blocks. Block 1, the sky element is reduced. Not by very much really. A circle, the sun. It was then printed with a relatively bright orange-yellow. There are two reasons for this colour: to let the sun show through as a definite yellow and to become the base colour for the sunset clouds which will appear later. The cloud element is made up of two blocks. This block, which creates the positive elements, the parts that are inked and printed, and block 1, which, when printed later, will create a negative mark. It is now that I need to transfer this cloud element to block 1, so I know where it is. I used a brushstroke motif for the sunset clouds, and people have asked how I do this. It's simple really. I draw lots and lots of example shapes using a brush and ink. Then I pick the ones that work best, scan them, then print to size as black as possible. Then I copy them onto the block and cut them out. Easy. The first brush mark overprints the paler sky with a stronger orange, making the sun appear even more yellow. The next part of the clouds is the second brushstroke, which takes a different path to the first, but it also overlaps the first quite a bit. Basically, this means removing parts of the first brushstroke to let the second overprint it. This is printed in an even darker orange. The sky area is printed later using block 1 when the clouds will be completed. So, now onto the sea. I'd already cut the splashes of white foam, so now I needed to link them together to form the waves. At the same time, I cut the rock face, vertical, haphazard, gouged marks. The sea, actually the waves, will be inked individually, which meant I could control the small graduated tones on each set of waves. But it was quite a laborious task, each step inked individually and a mask cut for each one to keep a clean line after the inking. All the horizontal strips of waves were created in the same vein, a mask for each one and a graduated colour slowly deepened in tone at each step. So I think we can whiz through these parts a little quicker without too much talking. Okay, this is where I stopped working on the sea for a short while. As you can see, it isn't quite finished, but there is a reason for this, which I will explain. The next step is to finish the sky. Clearly I didn't want the sky to overprint the clouds, so to complete the sky I first had to reduce the block and introduce the negative cloud element. If you remember earlier, I had transferred the cloud element from block 3 to this block. But the brushstroke clouds also extended further into this block, basically completing the drawing of the clouds started on block 3. This would let the original lighter orange base show through. It was now I decided I didn't really need the lower part of the print on this block, so I cut that away as well. Now I could print the sky element with a graduated roll from a blue to a lilac. You can now see how the original orange sky shows through, creating the clouds. I waited until I had completed the sky to finish the waves, and this is the reason. The final set of waves and the start of the top surface of the rock are printed in a relatively deep blue, which should help to create a straighter horizon line. Basically, it cleans up the edge made by the clouds and the sky. What's left of block 1, the rock, now overprints the blue with a transparent yellow, creating a green. The same colour also prints the vertical pattern on the rock face, but as it overprints a blue-grey, the green is less intense. This part of block 3 creates the shadow of the rock. I used a mask to print the correct shape, which avoided me having to reduce the block, which I would need later. You may have noticed that the sunset area is still there, even though I could have got rid of it. I've learned over the years not to cut away an area just because I think it's complete. If you remember, block 1 also contained the rock face. This allowed me, when necessary, to jump between the two blocks. In this case, a transparent brown-orange was printed over the whole rock face, which gave it a colour and also altered the tone of the existing vertical stripes. Once again, the sky above has been left intact, because, well, you just never know. I decided the green was too bright. To knock this colour back, I overprinted with a darker, transparent green. I also extended this down the rock face, in the hope of adding both depth and colour, but faded it toward the base. Rather annoyingly now, the rock face had too much contrast, so back to block 1 and I toned it down using a transparent, pale orange-brown. This also started to create the dark contrasts I was looking for. Now I could cut a set of vertical lines into block 1. These were cut to print both between the lines from block 3 and to also overprint parts of those lines. They were printed in a transparent blue that helped create a more fractured surface. Now back to the shadow. As before, a mask is used to keep a straight edge. The area is inked in an opaque purple, which would cover the dark base and allow the cut dots to come through in an exaggerated graduation. I'd previously lightened the top of the rock, then I darkened it. Now I felt it possibly could be a bit brighter and perhaps benefit from some form of texture. It's hard to see at this scale, so here is an enlarged version of the block. It was overprinted with a lemon yellow, and I think the texture did help to create a more interesting surface. Now for the foreground. This starts with a solid deep purple red, which will be the base colour for the boats. I want this area to be visually in the front, but if you make things too dark, they can leap forward too much. So the colour balance is important. The next reduction is the line art for the boats. But the boats didn't print yet. What that reduction did was to show me the shape that would be in shadow. To avoid inking the boats, once again I used a mask, and then printed this part in an opaque purple. The tonal quality was important. As a shadow it needed to be dark, but not so dark that the following step would have to be even darker and as such unbalanced. Throughout any print process, when using a mask, I always make it slightly smaller than needed. This avoids any gaps in the next step. In print, this is technically referred to as a choke. After the shadow area had been cut away, I could put the boats in place with a dark but dull red. Once again, the colour balance is important. I didn't want to overemphasise the boats, make them too dominant, so it wasn't too dark, but it had to be dark enough to draw them with solidity. That was definitely that. The rock was complete.